Ciao friends, and welcome to a new video from SQL BI. Now, if you follow our channel, you know that I typically start a video sitting at my computer because I want to show you demos about DAX features or ways to solve problems with DAX. But today, I want to experience a new level of boring Alberto. Today is just me standing in front of you and talking with the help of some slides, but that's it, there are no demos. And the reason is I don't want to explain you some details about DAX. Instead, I want to elaborate on a sentence that I often repeat to all of my students. The sentence goes like this. It says, DAX is simple, but it's not easy. The sentence by itself looks quite strange. How is it possible that a language is simple but it's not easy? But that is the case with DAX. And be advised, I'm not going to tell you that DAX is a simple language that can be perceived as a complex language by a newbie. That is not the case. I'm going to tell you straight that despite being a simple language, DAX is really hard to learn. And it does not matter how much experienced you are. You might have been writing code for years, you might be an Excel guru, you might be a great data modeler. Still, when you start learning DAX, you will find it really hard. That happens to everybody. So if you struggle in writing DAX code or in thinking the right way using DAX, you are in very good company. I've been there long ago and I struggle as anybody else. Now the thing is, in the last few years, I taught DAX to thousands of people. Therefore, I have some experience about the main reasons why I think DAX is a hard language to learn. That's why I wanted to record this video, to give you some advices. And again, be advised, you are not going to find DAX easier after you have seen the video. But at least you will not feel alone if you struggle with DAX, and you will have an idea about the main reasons why DAX is a hard language to learn. But let's start with the first reason. DAX is a functional language. Being a functional language means that no matter how complex your code is, the entire expression that you write is just a single function call. So there's always one function that calls other arguments, and the number of functions that are being called and the way they are arranged in your code defines the flow of execution. Now, functional languages are complex to learn, and you might have experience in other programming languages. To me, when I started writing code, I was 14 years old. That means 40 years ago. And I started, like many other people of my age, with BASIC. The B in BASIC stands for beginner. BASIC is a very simple language. It's an imperative language, meaning that it executes steps one after the other. If you look at the screen, you see that we have a program of eight lines, clears the screen, then gets a number, a second number, a third number, and then checks some conditions. You do not need to be a super nerdy geek in order to understand what this code does, because it's quite simple. It's a set of statements one after the other, and the execution starts from the first line and goes step by step until the end. That is the way we always describe any process. Imperative languages are the paradigm that work better. Most programming languages are based on the imperative paradigm. And even though you look at modern code like C#, despite the syntax being completely different, it is still an imperative language. So the functions are different, the flow of execution is different, it's based on object-oriented programming, so slightly different, but still statements one after the other. The thing is, imperative languages are one of the many different paradigms that exist over time. So, for example, there are other programming languages, like Forth. Forth is a crazy programming language that has never been popular because it was based on RPN, reverse Polish notation, extremely complex to use and to program, but still a programming language. Now, if you look at the code on the screen, that is quite impossible to understand because a simple expression like 2 plus 5 is written in for like 2, 5 plus in the opposite direction. I'm not interested in explaining Forth, I just wanted to show you that there are different programming languages. Forth is one of them, but there are others, like Prolog. In Prolog, the execution of the program is based on the demonstration of a logical theorem. So you start with assertion and then you ask to the language to demonstrate another assertion. And the set of these statements, of these assertions, is basically the way you write programs in Prolog. Again, Prolog is a very specific language, but again, it's just a way to tell you that there are different ways of writing the flow of execution of a program. And among the many different paradigms, there is also the one of functional programming. Probably the most known functional programming language is Lisp. If you look at Lisp code, it somewhat resembles DAX, mainly because there are a lot of parentheses. In functional programming languages, the execution of the program is based on one function that calls another function that calls another function. Specifically in Lisp, we were talking about lists and not about functions, but the idea is the same. Now let's take a look at DAX code. This piece of DAX code is taken from our DAX pattern website, and it's just the definition of one function. You see that it has somewhat the same flow of execution of a Lisp piece of code. Despite the languages being completely different, you see that the flow, at least the shape of the code, is quite close. In a functional programming language, the main problem is understanding where to start following the flow of execution. Because if you look at the code, we have a first variable that calls addColumns, which is a function that calls summarize, which is a function that iterates over balances and groups them by customer name. But is this the first piece of code that is being executed? Or maybe the first piece of code is the second variable, the max balance days with lineage. Or maybe it's the third one, or maybe just the return statement. Where do you even start looking at the code? How do you know and you understand how the code is going to be executed? That is one of the major problems of functional programming languages. In order to understand them, you typically start from the innermost expression, and then you add complexity one level at a time. But that is not always the case. Sometimes you do not start from the innermost expression because maybe you have a calculator that follows a different way of evaluating arguments, or maybe you have an iterator, or maybe you have a ranking function. There are different functions and different ways to follow the flow of execution. In order to understand how DAX works, you need to start reasoning in terms of functional programming languages. Just to give you an idea of how to follow the flow of a functional programming language, let's forget about DAX and let's look at this piece of instruction which I created out of thin air. These are the instructions to build a chair using a functional notation. You see, chair equals add, useCrew back, repeat for add, useCrew leg. Where do you even start reading these instructions? It's kind of hard. And the reason is you need to reason in terms of functional languages. You start from the innermost part. The innermost part is sit, and then useCrew leg. And then we have the add function. Add says, hey, take a leg, add a screw to it, and use it to add the leg to the seat. What you have as a result is a leg that is attached to the seat. Repeat this 4 times, once for each leg. Once you finished this repeat statement, you end up having the seat with the 4 legs attached. And then you use a screw with the back in order to add the back of the chair to the seat that already has the different legs. And at this point, you have built a complete chair. You see, it's not easy. It's not easy to understand. It's not easy to follow. Still, it's the nature of DAX. So you need to get used to it. And the only way you can get used to it is to try and repeat and practice several times the same functions. Trust me, After some time, you will be able to read functional languages as if they were imperative languages. It's just a different way of expressing the flow of execution of some code. Now, specifically to me, this has never been a problem because I have been learning different programming languages over the years. Therefore, I was already familiar with functional languages. But still, I really struggle with DAX for the second reason that I'm going to tell you. DAX is based on a small number of concepts: evaluation context, iterators, context transition, expanded tables. Once you master these 4 concepts, you already are a DAX guru. DAX has no secrets for you if you master these concepts. But when I say master, I really mean it. Master. You need to know everything about these details. Because DAX is not built on top of a lot of different functions which are specialized in obtaining different goals. Instead, it contains a set of building blocks, the basic DAX functions, and then they can be combined through these 4 concepts in order to build more complex expressions. But every time you write DAX code, you need to be very familiar with what the row context and the filter context are, how an iterator works, and the fact that an iterator generates a row context, the context transition, the way calculate does the transition from a row context to a filter context following a set of steps that you need to know really well. And then expanded tables sometimes are a problem. Now, you can live your life without even knowing about expanded tables. If you master evaluation context, iterators, and context transition, you already are a very good DAX professional. But you need to know these concepts well enough to be able to immediately answer to a very simple question. Looking at the code, what is the reason of calculate in the definition of max balances data? Is it required? Can you remove it safely? What happens if you remove that calculate? Why does the developer decide to use calculate there? You need to be familiar with these basic concepts in such a way that when you write code, if you need calculate, you know it already. You know the difference between using a column and using an aggregator over a column. I'm not going to explain these concepts here. We have an entire training that explains these concepts. The thing is, you need to be able to master them the right way. How do you reach the point where you really master these concepts? You need to practice and practice and practice again and never stop until you totally understand how a piece of code is being executed. And if a formula does not return the correct value, stop. Try to understand where the problem is. Try to understand what number is this computing, and then try to understand how to fix that. And stop there until you understood exactly the reason why the code was not working. Now, as I told you, I had to learn DAX by myself. There were no teachers at the time, therefore I had to learn by trial and error. I could ask to the development team of analysis services for help, but they were not teachers. It was just an exchange of emails. And I totally remember struggling and looking at code with no clue about why my code was not working. It took me a few months of trials, and I totally remember the day when I finally understood DAX. I was not thinking about DAX. I had my newborn baby and I was just walking around. And suddenly I stopped. Probably my brain was still thinking of some problem that I had in DAX. I just stopped, froze, and said, oh my gosh, so this is the way evaluation contexts are working. And once I understood that, once that click happened, that was the day that I started really mastering the basic concepts. Whenever I teach DAX, I always try to artificially induce that click in my students. So we deliver trainings, and the training is 3 days. You know what? The main theory of evaluation context, iterators, and context transition all happens during the afternoon of the first day. So at that point, you could say that the training is finished. There's no more anything new to teach. The thing is, the next 2 days are useful only to induce that click by showing examples and other examples and other examples and asking questions until I see in the face of my students that some light start to appear. That means they are starting to understand not the concept by itself, because the concepts are simple, but how relevant they are in understanding DAX code. If you are learning DAX, don't waste your time learning all the details about the functions and the arguments of functions and how they work, because that is something you can easily find on the web. As of today, I still go to the DAX website in order to understand the syntax of a function that I do not remember. If you are learning DAX, focus only on the main important concepts and stay there until you really master them. And you really will spend a lot of time learning the basics. Because another important reason why DAX is a hard language to learn is because it doesn't help you in any way. You write a function in DAX, you write a measure, you execute it, and if it produces the wrong answer, you know that there is a problem, but you have no clue where to search. DAX is not very forgiving. If you make a simple mistake, it produces the wrong number, or at least the number that DAX believes is the correct answer, but this is not the number that you want it to produce. So DAX is not gonna help you. You will write a piece of code, the number will be wrong, and you will need to fix the problem. Fixing requires you to understand first what number is being computed, and only later change the code in such a way that it works. Let's pretend you write a distinct count of the customers. So you want the number of customers sliced by year. The formula works just fine, but if you look at the total is not the sum of the individual rows, which is totally fine for a distinct count. But what if what you want is a different number? At the grand total, you want to sum the values year by year. Now, this is a very simple calculation that can be solved in DAX, but it's not trivial. So if you want to understand a bit better how DAX works, just try to solve this problem. Write a distinct count of customers and then produce the total that is the sum of the yearly distinct count of customers. Not just by obtaining the number, but by writing the code in such a way that it will always work and in such a way that you completely understand how this code works. I'm not gonna give you the solution. It's straightforward if you know DAX. It's a nightmare if you don't. So this is just a simple example of a piece of code that requires you to understand better the basic concepts. And don't move past these simple examples until you know how to fix them, because that means you are not still skilled enough with the basics. You need to practice the basics, to practice the fundamentals. You need to understand the fundamentals really well. Only once those fundamentals are well established in your brain, that is when you can move past them and start writing more important DAX code. And when you start fixing your code, do not go for trial and error. I know we all learn by trial and error. This is the way we learn everything. The way we talk, the way we write, the way we interact with other people. Everything has been learned by trial and error since when we were kids. Trial and error works with a lot of skills, including programming languages, but it does not work with DAX. And again, I know that because I've been there before. I tried to learn DAX by trial and error and it didn't work. It started working when I started to understand the fundamentals. So you need to understand them really well if you want to be proficient with DAX one day. If you need to fix a piece of code, you cannot just add calculate here or there and hope that that calculate will magically fix your code, because it is not going to happen. Or maybe you end up with a formula that works in a very specific scenario, but as soon as you change something in the filters, your formula will stop working. The reason is it never worked. It worked by chance because with a hammer you try to change the shape of a formula until it somewhat resembles what you want. But DAX requires you to be precise. If you don't know how to fix a formula, then go back to the fundamentals, read them again, because the answer to any DAX problem is always in the fundamentals, the evaluation context and the topics that we have seen in the previous slide. The best way to think about DAX and to learn about DAX is not by solving your practical problems. Now, I totally understand. You want to learn DAX because you have a practical problem to solve. You need to build a report, you need to create some dashboards, you need to compute values because they are required for the meetings. All these are legitimate questions, but it is not the way you will learn DAX. If you want to learn DAX, you need to practice the fundamentals. And to me, the best way to work with these fundamentals is to think at DAX or any DAX issue as if it were a game. Just try to solve simple scenarios or simple problems without the requirement of the numbers being computed faster or efficiently or on your database. Just try simple scenarios. We have the Contoso database. Try there to write code just for the fun of obtaining your goal. And if the code doesn't work, then slow down, go back to the fundamentals and try them again. During the process of learning DAX with formulas that have no specific purpose, it's like a game, but it's the right way of doing the things. You do not need to feel the pressure of building the next report. That is not going to help, because you will just learn the tiny bits that are needed in order to build the report, and that is not the correct way of learning DAX. Learning DAX requires time, so take a challenge like any formula that you want to compute, and instead of searching on the web for a solution, try to solve it by yourself, and take 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, whatever time required to solve it by yourself and understand exactly how it works. Once you have done that, you will have done one baby step in the right direction, which is way more important than building the next report. During the process of learning DAX, you need a good editor. And this is one of the scenarios where, unfortunately, Power BI really falls short, because the editor of Power BI is far from being perfect. The Power BI editor is basically a text box with a small font that can show just one measure at a time. So it's really hard to write code in an efficient way. Formatting the code is a nightmare. Just enlarging the font enough is a problem. You cannot focus on the DAX code. There are better editors. You can use DAX Studio. DAX Studio has a lot of advantages. First, the editor is way better. At least at my age, I can increase the font large enough to be able to focus on that. I can format the code in an easy way, and do not underestimate this, you can look at intermediate results. If you have a complex expression, you can run queries in order to understand the value of variables inside your measure. That has a lot of value. Moreover, you can also use Tabular Editor. Tabular Editor has by far the best editing experience of DAX that is available on the market. Tabular Editor is not free, you need to pay for that, but it's a tool. If you need it because you need to write a lot of DAX code, that is gonna improve your productivity by so much that is definitely worth giving it a try. And during the entire process of learning DAX, always remember, practice makes perfect. There's no shortcut, there's no easy way to learn DAX. If you think that in order to learn DAX you can just search on the web for a pattern, implement it without understanding how it works, and this is helping you in learning DAX, I'm sorry, mate, but it's not going to work. If you want to learn DAX, you need to practice the fundamentals. Practice the fundamentals. Did I say that? Practice the fundamentals. Understand them the right way. Take your time. Don't be in a hurry. Practice them until you completely understand the basic concepts of DAX. After some time, you will start writing DAX code and understanding it better. And at that point, going on the web and searching for a solution makes total sense, because you will be able to search for a solution, understand it, change it to fit your needs, and then implement it in your model. And you will be able to understand when it works, and if it doesn't, how to fix it in order to make it work the right way. As I said in the introduction, it's not that after having watched this video, you will find DAX simpler or it will be easier for you to learn it. My goal was only to tell you that if you struggle with DAX, well, you are not alone. All my students have been there. And the only way you can go out of there is to practice in order to learn functional languages, to learn the basics, to start using editors the right way, and to develop your code the right way. After some time, when that click will happen in your brain, and I'm totally sure that it will happen if you follow the right path, that is the moment where you will be with me saying, enjoy DAX.